The autumn of 1887 arrived early in the Rainy River district of northwestern Ontario. By the first week of October, the birch trees along the river corridor had already dropped their leaves, and a thin skin of ice had begun to form at the edges of the slower creeks each night. The settlers who had staked their claims along that corridor over the previous 6 years had learned to read these signs. They began splitting wood in earnest, reinforcing their cabin walls with whatever insulating material they could spare. Old canvas, river mud packed into the gaps between logs, bundles of dry cattail. It was practical, efficient, time-tested. It was what everyone did. And yet, that October, one man in the settlement was not splitting extra wood. He was quarrying stone. His neighbors watched from across the clearing as he hauled granite slabs out of the shallow ridge behind his property, dragging them on a wooden skid one by one toward his cabin. They watched as he disappeared inside with those slabs and did not come out for hours. They watched the shape of something rise inside his home, something tall, dense, and entirely unlike any fireplace or chimney any of them had ever built. And when Renwick Alba, the most respected mason in the entire settlement, a British-trained craftsman who had built chimneys from Glasgow to Guelph, walked over and looked through the open cabin door at what was taking shape inside, he turned to the small crowd that had gathered and delivered his verdict without hesitation. That column will crack at minus 30 degrees Celsius, vent smoke into the cabin, and cook nobody. It is a monument to stubbornness and a waste of perfectly good rock. The crowd laughed. The man inside kept working. Today, that stone tower is the reason we're going to talk about one of the most underestimated principles in the entire history of frontier survival engineering, and why the man who built it understood something about heat that his critics, for all their experience, simply could not see. If you've ever wondered why some frontier cabin stayed warm on half the firewood of their neighbors, and why nobody talks about this, hit subscribe right now. Every week on this channel, we go back to the techniques that worked when the stakes were real. Hit the like button. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from, and let's get into it. Callum Dreas was 44 years old in the autumn of 1887, and he had been cold before. He had grown up in the granite highlands of Perthshire, Scotland, where the winters were damp and cutting away that got inside your joints before you noticed it was there. He had emigrated to Ontario in 1881 with a trade, quarrying, and a stubborn conviction that stone was the answer to almost any problem a man might face in a cold climate. He had built his cabin in the Rainy River district the same way every other settler had, notched spruce logs, a clay and moss chinking compound between the courses, a standard open-face fieldstone fireplace on the east wall, a puncheon floor of split logs laid directly on the earth. It was a solid cabin by the standards of the time. It was also, by Callum's reckoning, a sieve. The numbers told the story plainly. In the winter of 1884 to 85, Callum burned through 5 3/4 cords of firewood. In 1885 to 86, the winter was harder and the consumption climbed to just over 6.5 cords. He was spending more time cutting, splitting, and hauling than almost any other activity from October through March. And despite that effort, the cabin lost most of its heat within 2 hours of the fire dying down. By 4 in the morning, the floor planks were cold enough that the condensation on the underside of the door had turned to frost. His wife wrapped herself in layered wool blankets every night. His 2 youngest children slept in a pile near the firebox, rotating like bread on a griddle to keep their backs from going cold. The fireplace itself was a problem, though Callum did not frame it that way at first. He framed it as a wood problem, a supply problem. But the more he thought about it, the more clearly he saw the mechanical reality. A standard open-face fireplace radiates heat well in one direction and loses a majority of its combustion energy straight up the flue. The stones around absorb some warmth during the burn, but the mass is too thin, typically 6 to 8 inches, 15 to 20 centimeters of stone, to store more than a fraction of that energy. When the fire dies, the stone cools within an hour. The cabin temperature follows it down. Callum had seen a different approach once, years before he left Scotland. An older quarryman in his village had described the great masonry heating towers he had heard about from Baltic traders, dense stone or brick columns with small internal firebox, built not to burn hot and fast, but to absorb heat slowly across a large mass and release it over many hours. The Baltic traders called them variations of a concept that was old when their grandfathers were young. Callum had filed the idea away and never thought much more about it, until the winter of 1886 to 87, when he burned 6 cords of wood, and his family was still cold. That spring, he made a decision. He was not going to split more wood. He was going to build something that needed less of it. What Callum Dreas designed and built over the summer and early autumn of 1887 was, in the language of modern vernacular engineering, a freestanding interior thermal mass column, though he would not call it anything so formal. He called it simply the tower, and he described it in a brief entry in his personal ledger, a document that local historical accounts suggest survived in the Dreas family until at least the 1930s, as a stone body to hold a fire's memory long after the fire itself is gone. The structure was built against the cabin's north interior wall, centered to allow airflow around all 4 sides. At its base, the footprint measured 4 feet by 4 feet, approximately 1.2 m times 1.2 m. It rose to a height of 9 feet, 2.7 meters, stopping just short of the ridgeline. The core was built from dense granite slabs quarried from the ridge behind the property, with a secondary fill of sandstone cobbles packed tightly into any remaining voids. The total estimated weight of the stone mass was between 3,600 and 4,000 pounds, 1,630 to 1,815 kilograms. At the base of the column, Callum cut a small firebox opening, roughly 14 inches wide by 10 inches tall, 36 centimeters times 25 centimeters, lined with flat sandstone slabs chosen for their ability to withstand repeated thermal cycling without fracturing. The flue ran internally through the mass itself before exiting through the roof, meaning that the exhaust gases had to travel up through and around the stone before escaping, heating the column from the inside out rather than losing that energy straight to the sky. This is the fundamental physics that Callum had grasped, and that his critics had not stopped to consider. Stone, particularly dense granite and sandstone, has what physicists call a high specific heat capacity. In practical terms, this means it can absorb a large amount of thermal energy without its surface temperature rising quickly. The flip side of that property is equally important. Once that stone is saturated with heat, it releases that energy slowly, over many hours, at a low and steady radiant temperature. It does not spike, it does not surge, and it does not quit the moment you stop feeding it fuel. A column of 3,800 pounds, 1,720 kilograms, of granite and sandstone, fired for 2 hours with a moderate hardwood fire reaching internal temperatures of around 400 to 450 degrees Fahrenheit, 205 to 230 degrees Celsius, can store enough thermal energy to continue radiating warmth into a small cabin for between 8 and 12 hours after the last piece of wood is added. Think of it this way. A standard cast iron stove is a sprint. It heats fast, peaks fast, and cools fast. Callum's tower was a marathon runner, slow to warm up, but still going long after the sprinter had stopped. The technique was not entirely new. The Romans had used a related principle in their hypocaust systems, circulating hot air beneath stone floors to heat entire bath complexes. In Korea, the Ondal floor heating system had channel combustion exhaust beneath stone and clay floors for centuries. The Finnish and Baltic traditions of contraflow masonry stoves operated on the same thermal mass logic. What was unusual, and what made Callum's construction genuinely controversial, was building this kind of structure inside a small frontier log cabin, in a community where firewood was abundant, in a culture that associated large stone construction with permanence and formality, not with practical everyday heating. The column occupied a significant portion of the cabin's interior. It took Callum 11 weeks to build, working around his other obligations. The mortar mix he used was a traditional lime and sand composition with added clay, stable, slow-setting, and capable of handling the thermal expansion and contraction cycles that would come with repeated firing. He cured the structure slowly through September and early October, lighting small test fires and letting the heat work its way into the mass gradually, avoiding the thermal shock that could fracture green mortar joints. It looked, from the outside, like nothing anyone in the settlement had seen inside a cabin before. It looked, to more than one neighbor, like a mistake. Renwick Alba was not a man who offered opinions quietly. He had arrived in the Rainy River District in 1883 after 30 years of masonry work that had taken him from Edinburgh to Liverpool, from Liverpool to Montreal, and eventually westward along the expanding rail lines into Ontario. He had laid fireplaces and chimneys in structures that were still standing. He knew stone. He knew mortar. He knew how heat behaved inside a wall, inside a flue, inside a firebox. When he looked at what Callum Dreas had built inside that cabin, his objections were not casual. They were technical, specific, and delivered loudly enough that several people standing 30 feet away in the clearing heard every word. His primary concern was the flue path, running the exhaust gases through the interior of a stone mass, rather than up a straight or gently offset chimney, created what Alba described as a pressure trap. If the draft was insufficient, if the fire did not burn hot enough, fast enough, to create the upward air pressure needed to pull smoke through that internal passage, the gases would backflow into the cabin. In a poorly built version of such a structure, that was a real and legitimate risk. Alba was not wrong about the danger in principle. His second objection was the mortar. The lime-clay mix Callum had used, Alba contended, would not survive repeated heating and cooling cycles at the temperatures a firebox demanded. "That mortar will crack," he said, standing in the cabin doorway with his arms crossed. "And when it cracks, you will have gaps. And when you have gaps, you will have smoke in your bedding and a fire risk in your wall." He gestured at the column with something between disdain and genuine concern. "This is not how stone heats a room. Stone surrounds a fire. It does not swallow it." Then came the social dimension, which was sharper than the technical one. Outside, where a small group of settlers had gathered, as they often did when Alba was involved in any kind of assessment, the verdict spread quickly. Someone called the structure Dreas Folly, and the name stuck. Others noted that Callum had sacrificed nearly a quarter of his usable interior floor space for the column. One man, a carpenter who supplied timber to several families in the area, shook his head and said what several people were thinking. A man who builds a tower inside his own house is a man who's given up fighting the cold and started worshiping it. Callum heard most of it. He did not argue. He had learned enough about stone, about how it behaved under slow, careful heat, to trust the physics over the opinions. He also knew something that Alba's criticism had glossed over. The internal flue path he had designed was not a straight vertical channel. It was an offset serpentine, a passage that rose, reverse direction once inside the upper mass, and only then exited at the top of the column. This design, borrowed loosely from descriptions of Russian and Scandinavian masonry stoves he had read about in an engineering pamphlet years earlier, forced the combustion gases to surrender more of their heat to the stone before escaping. It also, when the fire was properly established, created a natural convective pull that prevented backdraft. It was not elegant by any formal standard, but it was not guesswork either. Through October and into early November, Callum fired his tower daily. Small, steady fires of 2 to 3 hours each, building the thermal capacity of the mass gradually, teaching the stone to hold heat before demanding it hold the cold at bay. The neighbors watched the smoke rising from the column's flue and said nothing new. The name Dreas Folly was already part of the settlement's vocabulary. By December, Most people had made up their minds. January would unmake them. The cold snap that arrived in the second week of January 1888 was not, by itself, unusual for northwestern Ontario. The Rainy River district sat at a latitude where January temperatures routinely fell to minus 25 degrees Celsius or minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 13 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, and settlers had built their routines around that reality. What was unusual about January 1888? What local land agent records from the period describe with the kind of precise, careful language that men use when they want to be believed was the duration. The temperature dropped to minus 38 degrees Celsius, minus 36 degrees Fahrenheit on January 9th, and did not recover above minus 35 degrees Celsius, minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit for 9 consecutive days. On January 12th, the mercury in at least one recorded instrument in the district reached minus 42 degrees Celsius, minus 44 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature at which exposed skin freezes within minutes, at which the sap in living spruce trees contracts audibly, at which the air itself feels different in the lungs. For the wooden cabins in the settlement, the arithmetic of survival became brutal very quickly. A standard log cabin of the period, with an open-faced fieldstone fireplace, clay chinking and no additional insulation, could maintain a livable interior temperature during normal January conditions with fire running 12 to 14 hours per day. At minus 42 degrees Celsius, minus 44 degrees Fahrenheit, that same cabin required the fire to run nearly continuously to keep the interior above freezing. The walls themselves, spruce logs averaging 8 inches, 20 centimeters in diameter, with their natural air pockets and the seasonal shrinkage gaps that open each winter, conducted cold far faster than anyone wanted to admit. The floors, laid directly on the earth, drew cold upward from the ground. Children were pulled away from the walls. Firewood stacks that had seemed adequate 2 weeks earlier began to look thin. Within the first 4 days of the cold snap, at least 3 families in the immediate settlement area had sent word to neighbors asking to borrow wood. The community shared what it had. That was the way of the frontier. But the sharing created its own pressure. By the 6th day, the carpenter who had called Callum's column a monument to a man who'd given up fighting the cold was burning through his emergency reserve. Callum Dreas lit his tower once each morning. He used a 2-hour burn, a carefully controlled hardwood fire built in the small firebox at the column's base, hot enough to bring the internal flue gases to approximately 350 to 400 degrees Fahrenheit, 175 to 205 degrees Celsius, before dying down. Then he closed the firebox door, banked a small ash bed, and let the stone take over. 3,800 pounds of granite and sandstone, already conditioned through 3 months of daily firing, absorbed that morning's heat and began the slow work of giving it back, not in a surge, not in a spike, in a steady, low-intensity radiant warmth that moved outward from all 4 sides of the column in every direction, touching the walls, the floor, the air in every corner of the cabin. By noon, with no fire burning, the interior of Callum's cabin was still 58 degrees Fahrenheit, 14 degrees Celsius. By 4 in the afternoon, it had dropped to 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius. By midnight, with 12 hours gone since the last flame, it held at 46 degrees Fahrenheit, 8 degrees Celsius. Nobody came to check on Callum Dreas during the cold snap. They were too busy managing their own fires. Stay with me, because the number that came out of that cabin in January of 1888 is the number that ended the argument permanently. And the man who had called Callum's tower a monument to stubbornness came back in the spring asking quiet questions. Subscribe if you haven't yet. You don't want to miss what comes next. When the cold snap finally broke in the 3rd week of January 1888, and temperatures climbed back toward a more familiar minus 20 degrees Celsius, minus 4 degrees Fahrenheit, the settlement began its accounting, not a formal accounting. Frontier communities did not produce official thermal performance reports, but the kind of informal reckoning that happens naturally when people come together after shared ordeal and compare notes. How much wood did you burn? How cold did it get inside? How many nights did the floor freeze? The comparisons that emerged around Callum Drea's cabin were, by those accounts, striking. His nearest neighbor to the west, a man of approximately the same household size, had burned through his entire reserve of 6 cords and was barring against a spring cutting by the end of the cold snap. A family to the north, with a slightly larger cabin, had maintained continuous fires for 7 of the 9 days and still reported interior temperatures dropping to near freezing between midnight and 4 in the morning. A third household, whose patriarch was among the most experienced woodsmen in the district, had managed the cold competently, but at the cost of nearly 5.5 cords of hardwood across the full period. Callum's tally for the entire winter of 1887 to 88, including the January cold snap, came to approximately 2 cords of hardwood. Oral accounts recorded in later years by his daughter place a figure between 1 3/4 and 2 1/4 cords, depending on how precisely the stacks were measured. Even taking the higher estimate, the difference was not marginal. Against the neighborhood average of 5 to 6.5 cords, Callum had heated his cabin through the same winter, including 9 days at or below -40 degrees Celsius -40 degrees Fahrenheit, on roughly 1/3 of the firewood. The physics behind that number are not mysterious. They are simply the arithmetic of thermal mass applied honestly. Granite has a specific heat capacity of approximately 0.19 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. Sandstone runs slightly higher, around 0.21 BTU/lb degree F, blended across of 3,800 pounds, 1,720 kilograms. Column of mixed granite and sandstone, a 2-hour hardwood fire capable of raising the stone's average internal temperature by 80 degrees Fahrenheit 44 degrees Celsius deposits somewhere between 57,000 and 65,000 BTUs into the mass. A typical cast iron box stove of the 1880s, burning comparable wood for 2 hours, delivers most of that heat into the room immediately and retains almost none of it after the fire dies. The stone column retains all of it and releases across the next 8 to 12 hours at a rate of roughly 5,000 to 7,000 BTUs per hour, low, steady, persistent. During the January cold snap, with exterior temperatures at -42 degrees Celsius -44 degrees Fahrenheit, Callum's cabin required a heat delivery rate of approximately 4,000 to 5,500 BTUs per hour to maintain an interior temperature above 45 degrees Fahrenheit 7 degrees Celsius. The column, at the midpoint of its release curve, was delivering almost precisely that. The math, in other words, was close to perfect, not because Callum had calculated it formally, but because he had understood the principle well enough to build a structure that embodied it. His nearest neighbor's cabin, with its open-faced fireplace and thin stone surround, delivered its heat in a spike and then surrendered it to the walls in the cold night air within 60 to 90 minutes of the fire dying. Running that fireplace continuously through the night required someone to be awake to tend it. Callum slept through the night. His wife slept through the night. His children were warm. Renwick Alba's predicted crack in the mortar did not appear. The internal flue passage did not backdraft. The column, after 3 months of conditioning and a full winter of active use, showed no structural failure of any kind. In the spring of 1888, when Callum chipped away a small section of the lime clay mortar at the firebox level out of his own curiosity, he found it harder than it had been when he laid it. The repeated heat cycles had driven off residual moisture and set the binder more firmly than a cold cure ever could. The column had not merely survived the worst winter in recent memory. It had performed exactly as the physics said it would. It was April. The snow still deep on the north sides of the ridges, the river ice cracking and groaning in the afternoons. When Renwick Alba walked across the clearing, and knocked on Callum Drea's door. He did not bring anyone with him this time. There was no small crowd, no carpenter, no audience for a verdict. He came alone, in the early morning, and when Callum opened the door, Alba did not offer an apology or a preamble. He looked at the column, still radiating a faint trace of warmth from the previous morning's fire, and he said, simply, "Show me the firebox dimensions and the mortar recipe." Callum showed him. Alba spent the better part of an hour inside the cabin. He measured the firebox opening with a folding rule. He examined the joint lines between the stone courses at the firebox level, the area most subject to thermal stress, and ran his thumbnail along the mortar without finding a gap worth noting. He looked up at the point where the internal flue channel reversed direction inside the upper mass, and was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The serpentine is a part one didn't credit you for." He did not say anything else critical. He did not say anything else complimentary, either. He folded his rule, pulled on his coat, and walked back across the clearing. That exchange, reconstructed here from family oral accounts recorded in a local historical collection, was the closest thing to a formal acknowledgment that Callum's critics ever offered. There was no public retraction, no announcement, no ceremony. But the information traveled the way information always traveled in frontier communities. Quietly, through the people who had been watching, and through the families who had burned 6 cords of wood through January, and were now thinking hard about what they would build before the next winter came. By the autumn of 1889, at least 4 cabins in the immediate Rainy River corridor had incorporated stone thermal mass elements into their heating systems. 2 of them with full interior columns modeled closely on Callum's design, 2 others with modified versions using river granite, and a larger firebox opening to accommodate a faster initial burn by the winter of 1890 to 91. Oral accounts suggest that number had grown to somewhere between 9 and 12 structures within a 30-mile radius, each adapted to whatever local stone was available and whatever interior space the builder could spare. Alba himself built a thermal mass column into the structure he was contracted to construct in the spring of 1889. He used a slightly different mortar composition, a Portland cement partial replacement for the lime binder, a more modern formulation that was becoming available through supply channels from the east, and he modified the firebox to include a cast iron damper that allowed the draw to be adjusted after the fire was lit. It was a better version in several technical respects. It was, recognizably, a descendant of Callum Drea's design. The phrase that circulated through the settlement during those years, recorded in at least one letter from the period that passed through a regional land agent's hands, was brief and accurate. He wasn't being stubborn. He was being Scottish about his firewood. The community did not adopt Callum's approach because of any formal argument or public vindication. It adopted it because 2 cords of wood against 5.5 was a gap that nobody could ignore once they had seen it survive a January at minus 42 degrees Celsius, minus 44 degrees Fahrenheit. Practicality on the frontier was always the final authority. There is a particular kind of knowledge that only becomes visible under pressure. Mild winters are forgiving. They allow inefficiencies to hide, allow waste to go unnoticed, allow a flawed system to function well enough that nobody questions it. The winter of 1887 to 88 in the Rainy River District was not mild. It was the kind of winter that stripped every system down to its essential physics and asked, does this actually work, or does it only work when the cold cooperates? The open-face fireplace failed that test. Not because it was poorly built, but because it was the wrong tool for the job. It was a sprint engine in a marathon race. It delivered heat in a burst, demanded continuous attention and fuel, and surrendered its warmth to night within minutes of being left alone. For most winters, that was an acceptable trade. For 9 days at minus 42 degrees Celsius, minus 44 degrees Fahrenheit, it was an equation that required more wood than many families had. Callum Drea's stone tower passed that same test not because of any miracle, and not because Callum was a formally educated engineer. He was a quarryman with a ledger, a memory for things he had read, and a very clear-eyed frustration with burning 6 cords of wood to keep his family cold. What he understood, and what his critics had not paused to consider, was that heat is not just something you generate. It is something you can store. And the difference between generating heat and storing it is the difference between a fire that dies at midnight and a stone that is still warm at noon the next day. The principle Callum applied has names today that he did not use: thermal mass, specific heat capacity, radiant heat transfer. The modern versions of his column live on in rocket mass heaters, systems that burn a small amount of wood in a highly efficient combustion chamber and route the exhaust through a large thermal mass before releasing it, achieving heat retention figures that would have seemed remarkable even to Callum. They live in modern masonry heaters, in passive solar design, in the thermal battery walls that off-grid builders now incorporate into our ships and earth-sheltered homes. The engineering has been refined. The physics have not changed. What has changed, and what is worth sitting with for a moment, is our relationship to the knowledge. Callum Dreas did not have access to a thermodynamics textbook or a BTU calculator. He had access to stone, to observation, to the memory of something an older man had described to him years before, and to a bone-deep unwillingness to accept a winter that was costing his family more than it had to. That combination of resources, material, memory, and refusal produced something that outlasted every criticism directed at it and outlasted the winter that tested it. The most dangerous assumption a frontier builder, or any builder, can make is that the system everyone is using is the best system available. Sometimes the best system is the one nobody has bothered to build yet, because the winters have been mild enough that the worst one still works. Callum had 2 options in the spring of 1887. He could split more wood, or he could think differently about what it was actually for. He chose to think. The stone remembered the choice all winter long. That is the lesson. Not that stone is better than iron. Not that old techniques are always superior to new ones. The lesson is that the correct unit of measurement for a heating system is not how hot it burns. It is how long the warmth lasts after the fire dies. Callum measured in hours. His neighbors measured in cords. By the end of January 1888, everyone understood which measurement mattered more. The frontier did not reward elegance. It rewarded what worked when the temperature read -42 degrees Celsius, -44 degrees Fahrenheit, and there was no one coming to help. Callum Dreas' stone tower worked. That's the story of a man who trusted physics over consensus and built the warmest cabin in the settlement on 1/3 of the firewood his neighbors burned. If this gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It takes 1 second, and it helps this channel reach people who still care about knowledge that actually worked. Subscribe if you haven't already. Every week we go back to a technique like this one. Real, grounded, and built by people who didn't have the option of being wrong. And now I want to hear from you. Which part of Callum's solution would you apply to your own home or shelter? The thermal mass column? The serpentine flue design? The slow curing process? Tell me in the comments, and tell me the coldest winter you have ever lived through. I read every one. We'll see you in the next one.